In many of those other domains, aggressive or otherwise poor selling practices are things the customer accepts that they must endure. It is only in a relationship with an advisor, such as a consultant or financial planner, or a practitioner, such as a designer or engineer, where the conduct of the expert in the sales role so directly shapes the client's perception of what they are buying. That was a little bit from Blair Enns' latest book, The Four Conversations, and here to discuss it today with me is the man himself, Blair Enns. So Blair, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mickey.
Yeah, glad to have you here. So you guys may know Blair Enns. I've talked about him some on here before in my blog and stuff. He wrote the Win Without Pitching Manifesto, which was transformational for many of us, and has the long-running podcast Two Bobs. He puts out with David C. Baker, which is just a fantastic show. The number 2, BOBS.com is their site, as they say. It's one of those shows that for a little while I listened to the episodes that sounded good, and I learned very quickly just to listen to all of them, because even if it's not a topic that I think applies to me, it still applies to me. So it's a fantastic show, and we appreciate all you've put out. But your latest book, The Four Conversations, is fantastic because this is something I struggle with personally. It's just how to shape those conversations, and again, something you're so good at. So let's kind of unpack, I think, the four conversations and go through. But before we do, I guess you want to give kind of an overview of why you wrote this and what you tried to accomplish here?
Yeah. So why did I write it? You'd think I'd thought of this question before. I don't know. It is, I think of the book as the here's how to follow up to the Win Without Pitching Manifesto. So the manifesto came out in 2010. It's approaching 15 years old now.
Yeah.
And I think of that book as a yes, you can book. In 2000, so it's a little light on application. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a manifesto after all.
Right.
So I think that book has accomplished what I hoped it would accomplish. In 2008, I wrote Pricing Creativity, A Guide to Profit Beyond the Billable Hour. That was really a here's how-to book written specifically on the subject of pricing. Now, this is the follow-up to the manifesto with a bunch of pricing stuff in there as well. So it really is, the motivation for writing the book, lots of motivations, but a key one was this book is essentially the core of our training program. So when people go through Win Without Pitching training, it is on the Four Conversations, which is our model for how any expert should sell, and we can get into that. And I think anybody who owns a training business who contemplates putting their model out there in the world in the form of the book, there's some concern that it will cannibalize training, but actually what it does for us in the training front is it allows us to spend less time downloading information and more time just practicing and coaching to what is in the book.
Gotcha. And so I think that's a good lead into the first conversation, because the first conversation is kind of a gotcha in a way, because it's not really a conversation you have directly. It's the stuff you just talked about. It's having people trained up so when they first meet with you, you've already had a conversation without talking to them. Is that a fair way to put that probative conversation?
Yeah, so the first conversation, the probative conversation, is the conversation that happens without you present. It is effectively your reputation preceding you. So it's a function of your business strategy. What business are you in? Where will you play and how will you win? Choose your definition of strategy. Right. Positioning language. So how will you position your offering against the alternatives, against your competitors? And then lead generation. Effectively, how will you prove your expertise in the public domain and drive inbound inquiries to you with you already seen as the expert? And I'll make this generalization here as we do in our training and as I do in the book. And so all generalizations are kind of untrue, but they're helpful. The generalization is in your relationships with your clients and therefore prospects, you can be seen as a vendor or the expert. So you might think of those as endpoints on a spectrum, but I think of it as one or the other, binary. And the goal of the probative conversation is to move in the mind of the client from the position of a vendor where you have very little power in the buy-sell relationship to be seen as the expert, the one they want to do business with. And again, as you pointed out, the probative conversation it's kind of a construct of this conversation that happens through your agents of thought leadership, the content you put out there, and referrals, those who are referring business to you. And the goal is for them to drive inbound inquiries with you already in this power position where you're seen as the expert. Your expertise is recognized and valued.
Yep. And we see this a lot. We talk a lot with folks about where Google is shifting these days, where people are doing many more branded searches than creative searches on Google because they find their experts elsewhere and go to Google and just say, all right, I know I want to hire Blair Enns. Let me just type in Blair Enns versus I need help with, And so this conversation accomplishes that. They know you're the expert before you start. And you call it the flip. You see, the flip is our name for the moment when we move from vendor to expert. But you also don't say it has to happen up front. You say if the flip does not happen in the probative conversation, we must seek to make it happen in subsequent conversations. So I think that becomes a little trickier too then. I guess we can kind of move to the second conversation, or realistically the first actual conversation, the qualifying conversation. So I guess there's two ways people come in. One is you are the expert, Blair. I want to hire you. You're perfect. I've already seen that. Or the flip hasn't quite happened yet. And so I would guess at that point, you're considered one of the experts, I would hope. I don't think there's many cases where you'll be just a vendor, although I suppose there's some. But so how does that work in the qualifying conversation? Because I think part of that is you qualifying them. Are we a good fit for each other? But also making sure that flip has happened if it hasn't already.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things going on here. The objective of the qualifying conversation, which is the first person-to-person conversation, is to vet the lead. It's the vetting conversation. Vet the lead to see if an opportunity exists and determine the next steps. And there's a secondary objective of maintaining the expert position in the relationship. So everything that you do, work so hard to do, and it really is time and effort to kind of accomplish this probative conversation, to have a reputation that drives the flip.
Oh, yeah.
If that happens, then your secondary objective while qualifying, while vetting, is to make sure you don't give up the high ground that you earned in the probative conversation. Now, if the flip hasn't happened, effectively there was no probative conversation, and you find yourself in that person-to-person conversation, the first one, which we call the qualifying conversation, and you ask the inbound inquiry, somebody reached out to you, say, well, how did you hear about us? And they say, oh, I Googled whatever your service, digital agency Denver, and you came up number 7. Well, the flip hasn't happened. They've just done a search. So you have two different dynamics in play. And so the qualifying conversation framework is about you vetting the client, but as you pointed out, Mickey, the client will also vet you. Yep. We don't worry so much about that. We allow that to happen in a certain way, but you're vetting the client from this position of the expert. And if you haven't obtained that position yet, that is your secondary objective, is to obtain it.
And you mentioned maintaining it too. So how would someone not maintain it? So they see me as the expert. I succeeded. I'm the expert. They have the call. What am I doing that blows that and loses the expert position there?
You start behaving like a needy vendor.
There you go.
So we know what needy vendor behavior looks like.
Oh, yeah.
You're smiling, nodding yes while you're thinking no. You're not letting the client finish their sentences, but they start talking about what they need, and you say, we can do that. Yeah, we've done that before. You're eager to please. You're in convince mode. You're presenting rather than being present. All of these signs. All of these signs that say, I'll borrow language from Oren Klaff, which we use in training and in the book, but all his language is, I am the prize. All of your language says, you, Madam Client, you are the prize to be won in this relationship, and I would be lucky to win that prize. Yeah. The reversal of that is, I am the expert, I am the prize. And you don't say that out loud. It's your tone and manner. It's the way you show up. It's the way you navigate these frameworks. It's not about using the frameworks for these conversations. It's what version of you shows up and uses these frameworks.
Yeah. You mentioned the expert's mantra that you should sort of have in mind for this. And the first line of it is, I am the expert, I am the prize. I am on a mission to help, have that purpose. I can only do that if you let me lead, and I can accept that not all will follow. And I think that kind of gets back to the don't say yes to everything. I love one of your lines. I don't know that we'll get to it today, but if you don't say no, your yes is meaningless. Is just a life-changing line once you really unpack that. And the more you can say no, and I see that in other vendors too. I mean, I trust my car mechanic because I've gone there enough times where he said, no, you don't need to replace that part today. So when he says yes, you bet I'm going to replace that part because, he's built that trust. But
yeah, and I wish I knew who originally authored that line because it was not me. I don't know who the original author is. If somebody knows, please let me know. Let me know, because it's a great line. If you don't say no, your yes is meaningless.
Yep, love that line. And then you also said something you can say in this conversation is, quote, I'd like your permission to challenge something you just said. So again, not saying yes all the time, but fighting back. Almost a little bit of challenger sale kind of stuff in there where you kind of come in with a point of view that may be contrary to what they think, but you're the expert, so let's act that way.
Yeah, I was just doing an open coaching session this morning, and one of our clients was making the point that she's still overcoming the fact of years of thinking that she's in the service business. And in the service business, the customer is always right. And I'm fond of saying, I may say it in the book, you're in the expertise business. And in the expertise business, you should assume the customer is wrong until proven otherwise. I mean, don't overplay it. Don't be impolite about it. But it's the norm for clients to come to you self-diagnosed and self-prescribed and be wrong on one or both of those dimensions.
Yeah, you have people walk a fine balance between being pushy and telling people they're wrong, but not being a jerk either. Kind of like the wanting them to desire you more than you desire them, but not to be, I think you say, don't be aloof and arrogant. Don't be a jerk about it, but you are the prize to be won. And it's a fine balance, and I think it comes with training and just practice over and over. So love that. And you also break this into the 5 categories. I don't know that we'll dig into all those, but figure out what they need. And this is, I guess we'll unpack this a little bit because you talk about the context and desired future state and decision makers and that sort of stuff. Things like desired future state gets tricky to me in my mind here because you're saying, what do you want to be versus I'll tell you where you should be. So it's almost, I don't want to say needy, but are you coming saying, here's where you should end up, or should you ask them where they want to be?
So we're into the qualifying conversation framework. This is really a version of BANT, which was developed by IBM in the 70s, which stands for budget, authority, need, and time frame. It starts with need, typically. And as you point out, we call this desired future state. Anytime somebody is buying anything from you, they are buying a better version of themselves in the future. And what we're trying to do here is to find out what that better version of themselves is. There's a school of thought in this area of uncovering need that you just keep peeling. I call it peeling the onion of need. There's an approach that's commonly used. I used to teach it. It's called the 5 whys technique.
Love that.
Why do you reach out to us? Sales are down. But I need a new website. Why do you need a new website? Sales are down. Why are sales down? I don't know, blah, blah, blah. Right. Why, like a 5-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's just a better way to get to when you approach it that way, you're not necessarily even going to get to the heart of what the human being wants. So there are different ways to do that. But at the core, we're going to, in a B2B sale, maybe many listeners to this podcast will be in the B2B business, selling to other businesses. In a B2B sale, businesses don't hire businesses. People hire people, right? So we're just trying to humanize the sale a little bit more and say, get to the heart of what it is that this human being wants.
Yep, I like that. So at the end of this step, we mentioned earlier in the mantra, I accept that not all will follow. This is where, in theory, I would think a lot of them should fall off. A lot of leads should fall off just because they're not a good fit. They're not going to respect you. You've not obtained the flip. Like, do you see this being a case where you should lose a lot of your leads at that point, or many of them? Like, because you don't want to proceed with a bad fit. So how often should people fall off your chart here, you think?
I don't think there's I don't think you can average this out across different business types and industries.
Right, I'm sure.
And get a number. It's going to change depending on where you are in the lifespan of your business. It's going to change depending on how you go about generating leads. So if you have a broad-based like AdWords program or something that drives a high volume of inquiries, a lot of those inquiries tend to, it's not necessary, but it's not necessarily true, but they tend to be chaff that needs to be separated from the wheat.
Yep.
If you've been building a reputation out there in your market for 20 years, I mean, I guess I'm a good example here. We're 3 books, podcasts, etc. I have a lot of content out in the public domain for people to sample before they reach out. The norm is that people reach out already having absorbed a lot of our material and being quite familiar with their material and what it is that they're buying. So there's not a lot of weeding out as there might be, say, in some of our clients' businesses that have these lead generation mechanisms driving a high volume that need a lot of sorting.
Gotcha. And do you find that most people that have access to that, which is everyone, actually do absorb your material, or do you get a lot of calls where they're like, yeah, I've heard you were good, I haven't really looked at your stuff yet? I mean,
it's a timely question because something has just happened. We're recording in early February of 2025, if I'm allowed to say that, and something's happened in the last 60 days where I ask people, how did you hear about us? And the answer is no longer Google or I've been listening to your podcast for a while. It's I asked an LLM who is the expert at X, and your name or Win Without Pitching came up. And then my follow-up question is, well, what do you know about Win Without Pitching? And the common answer is nothing. Now, this is quite different from how search works. Search allows you to find the expert. Then you go on, if the expert is publishing a bunch of content, you go deep into that content, or at least a little bit. And you go into the content enough to go, okay, this is the person or organization for me. There's something going on with the LLMs where people are just taking the authority of the LLM and reaching out. So obviously that changes search, that changes how expertise gets found, and that's kind of beyond my domain. But I'm endeavoring to learn more. And how do we make our robot overlords work for us?
Right, and I think the best way to do that is to have lots of great content for those LLMs to consume, which you have done, and that's, I think, positioned you well, if by mistake. But I mean, the stuff you did to rank well in Google is now stuff they've absorbed for the LLMs and has put you in a great situation now. It's the battle of, I don't want the LLMs to steal my content, but I really don't want the LLMs to not steal my content, because you want them to have it so you show up there. So you've almost unintentionally done a fantastic job of positioning yourself well, where they've absorbed so much of your content. And again, you guys, one thing I love about your podcast, you have that full transcript. I mean, immediately I can find your site. Well, I go to that all the time. Like, I have this, Blair said this thing, I don't quite remember. I can search through and find the exact quote. But again, that's great for me, but it's also great for Google and for LLMs, because they absorb all that written content too. So kudos on positioning yourself there. But it's interesting. I would have thought people would say that, oh, win without pitching is great. Then they would go do some research. But it's interesting. They're seeing that and saying, good enough. Let's give them a call. So
sample size, it's still early. Sample size is still small, but there's something about the authority of that we grant LLMs that we don't.
Yes, which
grant
we really
search.
shouldn't, I don't think. But that's a whole different conversation too. So yeah. Well, let's move on to the third conversation, the value conversation. This is something value is something you and David talk about constantly for decades now, which is fantastic, but showing the value. So what does the value conversation look like?
So the objective of the value conversation is to endeavor to discover the value that you might help to create, and then what your share of that value might be in the form of compensation, again, while maintaining the expert position. So if you unpack that objective, what we're doing is we're not setting price specifically, but we're beginning to think and talk about pricing from the position of the value to be created rather than the position of the cost of our solutions. And one of the keys to the value conversation is you're walking through a fairly simple 4-step framework and not talking about or thinking deeply about solutions. So This is the hardest thing to learn.
It is, yes, for sure.
You've tried it. You've had some experience with it. It's hard to let go of, like, leaping ahead to solutions.
I have a solution. Let's go. We've got the for sure. Yeah.
Client starts talking. You think, being the subject matter expert, you think, I've seen this before. I know what your problem is. I know what your solution is. I know how much we need to charge to do this right. And you effectively quit listening.
Yeah, I can give you a quote right now. It's gonna be 20 grand, and here's what we're gonna do. Let's go. And that's
in that moment, I think value conversation mastery is easier. It's easier to get to the mastery level if you have nothing to sell, because our solutions, especially if we package them up, and I'm not trying to make the case to not package up your solutions, but as soon as you have like a product on the shelf behind you to sell, most of your brain is spent matching their need to your products.
Yeah, gotcha.
And if I took all your products away and you had nothing to sell, all you would have is this simple 4-step framework, and you would become a far better salesperson.
Gotcha. I love that. That's a great way to put it. And again, back to Challenger Sale, they talk about that too, where you talk about what the client needs versus what you can offer. It's kind of the step in there before you get to your specific offerings. Let's talk about what you guys really need. And as you pointed out, there's what they said they need and their budget, and then, really, there's what they said they need and their budget is kind of a separate piece often from that, and then what you could provide. So I think that's a good segue to go into the closing conversation, which I think is fantastic. And we talked about this a bit before the call, but the concept of offering 3 options, which is pretty simple, but you have pushed it so hard for so long that you forced us to do it. So thank you for that, because it's been fantastic. But something I heard differently in this book than I've seen before is we've always started with the anchor, start with the high one. Here's the $100,000 option, then 50, then 20. But you say, no, start with 100 and then go to the 20 and then come back to the 50. So the way I understand it, I guess it could go both ways.
Yeah, I'm stating my personal preference there. The only rule on that front is you always start with the highest price first.
For sure.
So what we call the anchor option, it's effectively employing what's known as the anchoring effect or the technique of anchoring.
Yep.
which really means that the negotiation starts from the first number stated. And there's a lot of really good science behind it, and most people are familiar with it by now. So I like to start high, go to the low option, because usually, not always, but usually the client has given me the low end of the pricing range, and it's in the form of their budget.
Yep.
So I start with an expensive, elaborate, and creative option, pushing the client to think expansively and creatively about new ways to create the value that they said they were looking to create. And often that transcends whatever solution they said they were looking for when they came to us. So get them thinking big in terms of the value that they might create, what it might take to do that, and how much they might invest to do that. And then go to the other end of the spectrum and say, well, you said your budget was X, 20,000 in this example. Let's use that. Here's what we can do for 20,000. And especially if it's underfunded, it's like, well, in the context of the anchor option we just discussed, it's disappointing. It seems like so small now.
Right.
And then I like to finish in the middle, because on average, that's where people will land.
For sure.
Right. It becomes the new safe zone between overspending and underinvesting. So that's the order I prefer. But the only thing that's really kind of a rule here is anchor high. Start with the anchor.
Gotcha. And I like the way you broke it down in the book too, and you just kind of did there too, where the big option is here's the dreamy, here's what we could do for you. The low option is here's what your budget said, and then the middle one is often here's what your requirements said, which is, you said you want all this stuff, which is going to cost $50,000. You said you have $20,000, and then here's an option for $100,000. And so that middle option kind of becomes, this is the stuff you said you wanted, but now here's the price attached to that, which is not what your budget was. What your budget is this other option, and you see what you lose. So I like kind of framing that. That gives a good way to kind of break down three options pretty easily. And again, both of those look small compared to the big option one, which, and we do sell the option one occasionally, but more often, we actually did this last year with a nonprofit. They said, I want option one, but I wanted option two's price. I'm like, well, of course.
Yeah, that's
of course
common.
Yeah.
And my response is, my kids want candy for breakfast.
Yeah, exactly. In their case, we negotiated and got there. They gave some free sponsorships and things. They're a company we really wanted to work with. But yeah, generally it's like, yeah, that's cute. I do too. But let's talk serious here. So the other thing in the closing conversation I love is you broke down that framework. I won't go through all the steps here. I'll read them quickly. But yeah, the time check to see how much time you have for the meeting. Just kind of framing the meeting for folks. The roll call, make sure people are there. If you're missing key people, skip out maybe. State the objective, recap the value, share the options finally, and then facilitate discussion and drive the next step. What I really like about this, though, is one, it's a great framework just to have in mind versus like, all right, here's the options. What do you think? It's, let's make it proper. But you said, we will find it valuable to have this agenda with us as a reference guide. We might even share a client-friendly version with all parties. Experts use frameworks. We do not hide this. And I thought that was fantastic. Say, hey, here's sharing that you have a framework. I think you compared it to a surgeon in the book where he said, you may not understand everything the surgeon's going to do, but you appreciate that he has a framework and idea of what he's going to do versus I'm going to go in and poke around and see what happens. Like, I want the guy that has a framework even if I don't get it. So I never thought of sharing this framework with a client. And again, you say a client-friendly version, so not necessarily the same, but say, hey, we know what we're doing. We have experts use frameworks, you have a lot of frameworks in this book. We have the 4 overall ones and it's kind of a mini framework inside of each of those too. So thoughts on how you should present some of that to clients versus what you should keep internal?
Well, just the idea that in your first job, being the expert advisor or practitioner or whatever you are, you're using frameworks, almost certainly using frameworks to do the work that you do. There is something about the domain of selling where we think that we have to be brilliant. We have to show, and we have to work without a net. I don't know where this comes from. So somebody who's used to using frameworks in their main job, being the expert, thinks they need to eschew the use of them in their second job, selling that expertise. It's a little bit ridiculous. So we all understand intuitively that experts use frameworks. If you want to be seen as the expert salesperson, then each of these conversations has a framework. So have the framework handy, be referencing it, take notes, make it obvious that you're taking notes, glance down at your piece of paper or your iPad or wherever the framework is and say things like, all right, next I'd like to ask you about X, and just come across as somebody, I don't know how else to say it other than an expert using a framework. You should bring that version of you to the forefront in the sale.
And this is why I appreciate you and this book so much, is because that's very obvious, but it's something we didn't do very well. And again, I don't know why. Like, we learned years ago that having a framework for our process was hugely important. I remember having somewhat of an argument with a potential client. He said, no, I want freedom to create and make something beautiful. I said, yes, the freedom will come through the framework. That's how we build it. The framework facilitates the freedom. Kind of like Jocko Willink says, I think discipline equals freedom. If you have the disciplines, it can create freedom for you. But I never converted that to the sales. Like, no, sales will just kind of talk through and see where it goes. And that's silly. Like, why not have a framework? And this book gives a fantastic framework for that. And I appreciate that. So it's been fantastic. So, yeah, Blair, this has been great. Any other closing thoughts why someone should pick up this book, or some insights along those lines?
Yeah, I think you read something and alluded to this off the top. I just want to make sure that this point is understood. The book is called The 4 Conversations. So we see the sale as a series of 4 linear and discrete conversations. Mm-hmm. Even though that's not always the case, it can be helpful for us to think of it this way. So think of it as 4 conversations. Anytime you're not in conversation mode, something is wrong. But the subtitle is A New Model for Selling Expertise. And why do I think the sale of expertise is different from anything else? It's because of the quote that you read off the top, which is, in any sale of expertise, the sale is the sample of the engagement to follow. It is where the client, 2 things happen. First of all, the roles are assigned. You will be seen as the vendor or the expert. And if you do not occupy the expert position in the sale itself, you will not be allowed to occupy the expert position in the relationship. And the second thing that happens is the client tries on what it would be like to work with you. So throughout the sale, they're taking all kinds of measure of you, of like, about your character, about how things are going to work, and they're extrapolating out into the engagement as they should. So if you show up as the polite, compliant, read needy vendor in the sale, then you're going to have to accept vendor status throughout the engagement. So I think there are some parts of selling or points of selling that are universal across all domains. But in the sale of expertise, how you sell says so much about what the client is that they're buying.
Yep. Love that. Fantastic way to wrap things up. So I mentioned the places people can find you, but where would you like folks to track you down? What website should they go to? What social media do you prefer? That kind of stuff.
Winwithoutpitching.com. I'm pretty light on social media these days, but LinkedIn, you'll find me on LinkedIn. And the book is The 4 Conversations, A New Model for Selling Expertise. You can find that at Amazon in all the formats.
Yep, awesome. I'll have links, all that in the show notes. And of course, Two Bobs is a fantastic podcast that all of you listening probably already listening to. I think the Venn diagram, we're completely encapsulated within yours in that. So it's fantastic. Blair, this has been great. Appreciate your time so much.
Thanks, Mickey. I had fun.
Thanks.